and just sit down in silence and listen. Listen to Ali Akbar Khan, or listen to Haydn, or listen to anything, listen to music, and just allow yourself to be moved by it without any sort of self-referential thinking, and allow that kind of union, with sound, dissolve in sound, deep listening. This Sama practice is about that.
Hi, gang. Welcome to the 10,000 Heroes podcast. This is one of your hosts, Nate Ramos, and today I'm very excited to present to you a conversation I recently had with Haleh Liza Gafori. She's a vocalist, she's a poet, she's a recording artist, she's an educator, the consummate performer. She has a book of her own poetry she's published, and most recently she has a book out called Gold. Gold is a collection of translations. They're poems by the 13th century Sufi mystic Rumi. I am certain you'll get no small amount of pleasure just listening to her recite this poetry. But even more than that, through conversation, Haleh is offering us this way we might use these poems as portals into a way of being, into a way of listening and being present in this world, getting to the heart of what Rumi was pointing at through these words. Watch out for the next episode, in which I'll debrief this conversation with my co-host, Ankur Shah Delight, and get in touch with us at info@10kh.show. And please follow us on Twitter at 10khshow. Please enjoy.
یار مرا غار مرا عشق جگر خار مرا یار توی غار توی خواجه نگهدار مرا دانه توی دام توی باد توی جام توی پخت توی خام به مگذار مرا حجره خورشید توی خانه ناهید توی روزه امید توی راه ده یار مرا دانه توی دام توی باد توی جام توی پخت توی خام به مگذار مرا روز توی حاصل دریوز توی آب توی کوز توی آب دهیم بار مرا.
Wow. It's a lot different to hear it that way than I'm used to hearing Rumi spoken in English.
Yes, there's a lot of wordplay, a lot of rhythm and rhyme, internal and external. And
just for the listener, and for me too, because I'm so ignorant, what language did we just listen to that in?
That's Farsi, which is also called Persian. So they're synonymous. Iranians call the language Farsi. Others call it Persian, but it's the same language.
It's so rhythmic. Is this inherent in the language, would you say? Or is there... It's such an incantation. It feels like something is being called forth when I hear you reciting in this way.
Yeah, well, he definitely played with words and was a master of rhythm and rhyme. And so a lot of the poems have this kind of propulsive, galloping forward motion that's very, very rhythmic. And he was often composing to a drum. And sometimes he was freestyling. Sometimes he was just spontaneously composing and people would write it down. So... yeah, the music is inherent in his work. There's terminal rhyme and internal rhyme. So dane toy, dam toy, bade toy, jam toy, puchte toy, kham be magzar mara. So inside that line you have dane toy, bade toy, jam. You have dam, jam, and kham.
And those are the internal. So that's within the line, and then there's terminal rhymes at the end of each line that are kind of making the couplets or...
Yes. And of course, like, it's a ghazal, so it's specific form. So the couplets don't necessarily have end rhymes. Within the couplet, there isn't necessarily an end rhyme, but there's a repeating refrain or sometimes a repeating rhyme in the last line of the couplet, right? In the second line of the couplet. So it's a little bit of a complicated form to just describe, this
Yeah,
way. If I
right.
had a chalkboard, it would be easier.
Get a diagram going.
Yeah. Yeah.
When you as a translator are approaching material like this, or I don't know if there is any material like this, but in this project, when you approach this material and you're having to navigate meaning, rhythm, the musicality, and rhyme, how do you decide what to keep? If I imagine, like, in a given line, maybe some of the rhyming can't come along for the ride.
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, translators have to be willing to let go of the music of the original language and make a music in the new language. What we don't want to let go of as translators is the content, the message, the meaning. So, because languages are so different, because, dom, hom, and jom, which is trap, raw, and cup, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're never going to make those rhyme in English. Those three words are not going to rhyme in English,
Right.
And so you let go of that, necessity to rhyme or necessity to replicate the music. That's one of the first things that the translators let go of. Now, sometimes translators do try to keep some level of rhyme. I have read certain Rumi translations where they've taken the Masnavi, which is rhyming couplets, and tried to maintain the rhyme. And sometimes it works, and sometimes you know that meaning was compromised in order to get the rhyme.
Mm-hmm.
And most people would not want to do that, because what you want to do is keep the meaning and make new music in the new language.
I hope this isn't putting you on the spot. I should have prepared you for this. Do you have the English handy?
Yeah, I do.
Could we hear that as well?
Sure.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So here is the translation. Friend, cave, love that burns through me and consumes me. You are the friend of my soul. Lift me up. You are spirit, savior, slayer, and slain. Inside your heart, mysteries stand naked. Press my ear to your chest. You are light, revelry, the road to triumph, the bird from the holy mountain. I am the seed in your beak. Drop and see, sugar and poison, tenderness and rage, room flooded with sunlight, house of the wandering star, garden of buds about to bloom. You are all of them, dear friend. Let me in. You are day and night, the feast and the fast. You are the harvest of my prayers when I have nothing but hunger for nothing but grace, down on my knees. Water and jug, soak me in your grace. Trap and bait, cup and wine, raw and cooked. Don't let me be callow. Don't let me be petty. Don't leave me raw. Cook me, burn me up. I'll rise. Restless with longing, my mind and body weave web after web. My own heart's ensnared. When they trust, they stop. The path to you opens without a word.
Of course, on this reading, cup, wine, raw, and cooked were popping out at me. And somehow...
Yeah, there they were, because I had mentioned them, right? Yeah.
Right, so they were in my mind.
Mm-hmm.
But there's some musicality, even though the rhyming's gone. It's still an intoning of sorts.
Mm-hmm.
Is that, I guess I could prove this for myself if I grabbed it and read it, but is that in your performance of it? Or do you find that there's a way that you still, without the rhyming, even without the meter necessarily, that in those words you're infusing a musicality, or somehow carrying that musicality forward?
Well, I mean, I hope so. I hope that there's a music, and that's, I mean, I think when one is writing poetry, sound is important, and the way that the words follow each other, and the kind of energy that is created through the rhythm, through the meter matters, and we strive for that, strive to make it work, So, if you feel a musicality in it, that's great.
You,
That's good.
that's a good thing.
That's one of my, I mean, that's a hope that happens.
You're a
Translation
musician,
process.
just to be clear for the listener. I
Yeah.
mean, you're an accomplished and wonderful musician. You're a singer, and you play. What are you first in your mind, a musician or a poet?
I think it just depends on the day.
What were you first in your mind? Your
Um,
story.
well, I liked to sing as a child. I started to write a little bit later. So I'd say I was singing first.
Hmm.
Hmm. Yeah.
This is the first time you've taken on a translation like this.
Yeah. I mean, I've translated other poetry, Persian poetry in the past. When I was getting my MFA, I took a translation class and started there. And then after that, I was translating different things for some time. And then in 2016, I started translating Rumi.
You started this project in 2016.
Yes, that is this book, right?
Why then, and why this project? How did that strike you, and why?
Well, I was looking at a translation. I was looking at a poem that I like a lot, and there was a line in it that I just wondered. I just wondered if it was correct. And so I looked at the original and I thought, that's not how I would have translated it. And I don't think that's what he was saying. So that moment where I looked and compared, a translation that exists to the actual text, and I saw that there was what I thought was a discrepancy. That's when I decided to try translating it myself. And so that was the first poem. It was just kind of, an experiment. And then after that, I followed my curiosity and continued, and it was fun. It was an exercise. It's a way, translation, of course, is a very intimate way of engaging with a poem. It's very, very intimate. And so I just enjoyed the process of being inside of language in that way. Also, when you're translating, as I said, you get to be inside of language, and you don't necessarily have to compose everything because it's already composed. The poem is there and you're translating it. So you're very much engaged in the process of communicating, but you're not necessarily writing the poem. So it's a nice way of being inside language.
Yeah, in that sense, you're an interpretive artist still, even as a writer. A translator, in that sense, like just like, I don't know, like I'd say like an actor, or even if you're singing someone else's chart, you're an interpretive artist.
Yeah, I think that's true to an extent. Absolutely. Absolutely. And some people shy away from using the word interpretation when they're talking about translation. But I think that when we're dealing with poetry, there is always a level of interpretation, because there are lines, that you'll take 10 very well-versed, very well-read readers in Persian, and they might argue about the meaning of a line. So then you, as a translator, you decide what he's trying to say in this line, hopefully using knowledge from the rest of his work, knowledge of the Sufi philosophy, so that it's not coming out of thin air. It's actually coming out of the artist's own work, and you are recognizing that this is, for instance, a message that he has communicated over here and over here and over here. So in this more elusive line, I'm going to say it is this, based on all of this sort of evidence, and this I'm talking about only in the lines that are very baffling and very elusive and that people will argue about. There's a choice there that has to happen. So you try to make an informed choice, and that's why it's good to know the culture well. It's good to know the writer's work well. It makes a difference.
Well, you said it's an intimate relationship with the poem, but would you say that across a project like this, it's an intimate relationship with the poet as well?
Yeah, it is. I think it's a love affair. I mean, also, people say translation is a betrayal. right? And okay, sometimes that's part of a love affair, betrayal.
Okay.
I also think it's a romance. It's a wonderful experience. Yes, of living with the poet's mind and heart and soul, living with their expression. As Rumi says, he says, "Eat my poems like Egyptian bread." You're eating the poem. And it's coursing through your bloodstream. You're waking up with it. You're riding the train with it. It's inside of you, hopefully. And then you transmit it in the new language. So, yeah, I think that there's a lot of love and delight and passion that happens, that is there in the process. One would hope, otherwise, why do it? Right.
Maybe we could say a few words, or you could say a few words about who this man was. Then that I think most people
Sure.
have heard the name and know some of the work, but perhaps you just give a little context when
Yeah.
Rumi was
Yeah.
alive. And
Yeah, sure. He was born in 1207. He was born in or near Balkh, Afghanistan. Some say he was born in Vakhsh, which is now in present-day Tajikistan. So at that time, there were no national borders, so these country names didn't exist. But he was either born essentially in Balkh, present-day Afghanistan, or Vakhsh, present-day Tajikistan. Anyway, the point is he was speaking Persian, and as a wonderful scholar, Ahmad Karimi Hakak, said, poets belong to languages, not to nations. So because he was born into the language of Persian, that was his mother tongue and native tongue, we say he was a Persian poet. And because most of his work was in Persian, we say he was a Persian poet. He was living in 1207. He was born in 1207. And he was born into a line of Islamic theologians. His father was a preacher. His grandfather was a preacher. His great-grandfather was a preacher. So he grew up doing fasting rituals. He grew up praying alongside his father. And they traveled across Central Asia for about 10 years, from all the way present day Afghanistan, all the way through to present day Turkey. And it was sort of a 10-year voyage.
doing
Part
what?
of,
Preaching?
well, yes, stopping in towns and living in different towns for periods of time. And I think, yes, his father was preaching in those places, and Rumi was studying. He was a very active, curious, avid student, a curious person, precocious, and people noted his magnetism even when he was a little kid. He was considered really quite a shining character even back then. And they were also doing this journey because the Mongols were invading. So the Mongols were basically marching and galloping across Central Asia and burning down towns, so they were also sort of keeping out,
They're refugees.
yeah, they were on some level refugees. Yeah, eventually more so. When they started, they weren't necessarily. It seemed that his father was voluntarily taking the family, but yeah, essentially, yeah, they were refugees as well. And then they settled in present day Turkey, and his father became a preacher and very well loved, or was working as a preacher there. He was already a preacher, of course. He was working as a preacher there, and then eventually the young Rumi, Jalaluddin Muhammad ibn Hussein Balkhi was his name. He followed in his father's footsteps and was preaching. And he became quite famous. People loved him. Apparently, thousands and thousands of people came, and he was called Molana, our master. And he was wearing his crown turban and his silk robe, and people loved him. And he was not so happy about all the fame and so on and so forth. And he was suspicious of it.
Yeah. At this point, his faith or this doctrine is that just Islam, traditional Islam?
Yeah,
or
yeah.
would you call him a Sufi at this point? Or is there a difference? Or do we have a total misconception of what those lines even mean?
Yeah, well, there were a range of ideologies based out of Islam. There were very conservative interpretations back then, as there are now, very conservative interpretations, and then sort of more liberal interpretations. His father was not incredibly conservative, but kind of conservative, certainly more conservative than Shams of Tabriz, who came into his life when he was 38, and
And
basically whisked him away from his job as preacher and so on, and said to him, listen, do you want to, be a bullhorn for scripture? Do you want to repeat all of this for the rest of your life, or find your own voice? And also he was inviting him to really live and feel what he was saying in his sermons. I mean, the sermons were about, to an extent, were about liberation from self.
he swept him off his feet.
Yeah, he swept him off his feet. Yeah.
And took him where? Was this to become another pilgrimage, or was it, how did that look?
They went into a friend's house, basically one of Rumi's friends. They did their retreat. They did like about 3 months together in this house, and Salahuddin was hosting them and helping out, probably with food and stuff. And the two men, these two massive minds, massive hearts that they were, got to sit down and engage in honest and intimate conversation, which is what Rumi was longing for. He didn't want, to live the rest of his life in a kind of scholarly and religious milieu that valued prestige and title and rank so much. He knew that that wasn't what it was about. On the one hand, they were preaching about selflessness and moving beyond self, but there was all this attachment to hierarchies, and he was done with that, So, and even though he was at the apex of it, he was the famous one. He was the one on top. He knew that there was no top or bottom, that kind of ladder was really irrelevant and not feeding the actual experience of unity and unification that he was preaching about. So in one of his poems, he says, for instance, look at me. Of all invited to this feast, I'm the lowest of the low. I'm so far gone in ecstasy, I can't tell up from down. So I'm so far gone in ecstasy, I can't tell up from down. The idea of winning and losing, the idea of being the famous one, or being, it didn't matter. Shams, this person that he was so attached to at this point, starting at the age of 38, and to the rest of his life, even though Shams died, he still was writing to him on his deathbed. This guy was a scruffy vagabond. He was not famous, prestigious, or anything like this. He was just honest and real and really living. Rumi felt he was really embodying some aspects of this philosophy, the Sufi philosophy, and he opened his heart, opened his door, broke him open, opened him to music, which some considered was a sin.
Some considered music a sin. At this point,
the very conservative, I'm talking now, the very conservative considered it a sin. But even Rumi's father, who loved music, he didn't really allow it to be part of their daily life, and he didn't really incorporate it beyond the singing of the Quran. He didn't incorporate it into their sort of spiritual practice. His father didn't, but Shams did. For Shams, music was central, and this was a big opening for Rumi, because when he engaged in deep listening, when he engaged in this kind of whirling practice too, which was dance, not even just listening to music, but dancing to it, he sort of sprung open,
That practice or that lifestyle is sort of a surrender to the ecstatic.
Yes. Well, and Sufism is often defined as the mystical branch of Islam.
Right.
And is a lot of people also believe that it has Zoroastrian components, pre-Islamic components woven into it as well, which I think is true to an extent. And it's also it's universal wisdom too, and it is about a lot of, well, I like to say the sum of the Sufi path is let me love more deeply, teach me to love more deeply. I'm here to love more deeply, and I will value the ecstatic, shamelessly value it. And this is actually part of humanity's salvation in a way, to value the good feelings that humans can have. In one of the poems, The cupbearer is an image or a character that appears a lot in the poetry. The cupbearer is basically the one who understands the ecstatic and brings it. So oftentimes they're bringing the quote unquote wine, but the wine isn't necessarily literal. So in one poem, it says, the cupbearer says, greetings, friends. To drink this wine is not a sin. To feel ecstasy is not a sin. Feeling guilt for feeling pleasure, that's your sin. That's your chain. Shatter it. Tear it off. Then invite the Puritans over. Today is an invitation to ecstasy. Let them know. If they turn away, let them go. Let them judge. Let them talk. Let them smear your good name. You'll have less to guard. Lover, the eyes of lovers behold you. Your friend is the sea. So just this idea of letting go of the name, letting go of your good name,
By that
attachment.
You mean, attachment to like this reputation, this ladder, this.
Yes.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Well, that was totally revolutionary at the time. I mean, that was breaking or shattering the expectations of someone like of Rumi's class, someone that had been educated at that level. And
yes, absolutely. I mean, the fact that he walked off with Shams, the fact that he took Shams as a mentor was a totally wild kind of gesture. You know, people were shocked by it. It was absolutely beyond everyone's expectations, beyond the social conventions of his time. And also to embrace music, to embrace dance, to embrace the ecstatic, and actually allow it to be, I don't want to say a goal, but allow it to be something that's valued was revolutionary.
and so you said that some of this composition was happening like live at a gathering. What?
Yeah.
Just to help me visualize or help the listener visualize what a gathering like this might have looked like.
Yeah, I mean,
set the scene.
The set. Well, it was called Sama gatherings of deep listening and whirling dance, and so there would be, you know, I'm guessing they would be at someone's house, and local musicians would come over. There was a drummer playing the daf, which is a frame drum, a round drum that looks like the moon. Sometimes it has chains on it, so when you play it and shake it, it has a shuk, 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 shuk sound. Sometimes, depending on. There was the ney, which is a reed flute. There were some string instruments, the robob, which is a string instrument. So, you know, I don't know how many musicians would gather with them, but certainly there were musicians and they would play. And Rumi deeply valued the act of deep listening, sama, you know, really, really allowing yourself to turn the mind off and follow the movement of sound and see what that does. You know, oftentimes at the end of his poems, he says khamush, which means silence. So he's telling himself at the end of the poem, enough, shh, listen.
You know, this image you're talking about, Shams sort of sweeping Rumi off his feet, and they abscond off to some retreat and then spend all this time sort of deepening this work. And sort of the same thing happened to you. In a sense, I mean, Rumi came and swept you off your feet and you absconded to a cabin in the woods or wherever you did the bulk of this work. And I wonder how that, if you're even able to articulate, but how that affair that you had with Rumi transformed you. This romance that you talked about, that this time you spent with this poem and these poems and this poet specifically.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's certainly a gift to be able to spend time with these poems. And certainly, you know, I started in 2016. And as I said, I would do one poem here, one poem there, one poem here, one poem there. Just, you know, it was becoming a hobby. And then it became a passion and I felt swept away by it.
Wait,
that is
sorry
true.
to interrupt. Did you have a notion that you were working on a project?
No, I didn't decide. No, I didn't decide at the beginning that this was going to be a book. Not at all. I just was doing it. I was just trying and
Yeah.
experimenting and exploring. And then eventually I had a lot of poems. And certainly the process was important for my psyche and for my heart. It's beautiful work. And there is an aspect of it that's, that I don't want to say therapeutic, but yeah, let's say therapeutic. There's a tremendous like aesthetic delight, and there's also, I mean, he's offering advice. He's offering us information about existence that's valuable, so yeah, I totally enjoyed it. And a lot of the work or one stage of the work was really happening during the pandemic. And so that was actually incredible to be able to sort of dive into his sea. The sea of Persian mysticism is a wide sea. He says it's shoreless and boundless sea. So it was liberating during this time of cloistering to be able to like sort of expand in this kind of state of mystical thought.
Were you born here?
Yeah, I was born here. I was born in New York City.
I guess I'm curious what it was like to kind of go back so far into your own culture, into this language, and what you found in that. Was there some kind of return, I suppose?
Yeah, it's weirdly comforting.
Yeah.
I like it. I like diving into Persian texts. And my great grandmother was a storyteller, and so my mother, when they were in Iran, my mother and her siblings would gather, and my great grandmother would tell stories. And some of the stories are backstories that are alive in these poems. So it's kind of like a torch was being passed on some level, from my great grandmother to my mother to me. My mother and I also engaged with this work a lot. She was really an important part of the process. We read the poems aloud together. We discussed them, so she's been a very important part of it. And that was an incredible way to bond with her and to get to know her. And yeah.
What are you feeling as it kind of approaches a release date?
I'm excited. I'm excited to share the work. I love the poems in the book, I really do. And I feel that they are alive, and I feel that they do carry his spirit and carry his messages, and I'm excited to share them.
A book of poetry that's 800 years old or thereabouts. What's still relevant right now for folks?
Well, some of the poems take on, at moments he's talking about greed, for instance, right? There's a poem where he sets up scenarios that are kind of apocalyptic scenarios. Famine strikes, and then scorpions overrun the world. He says, misers rule, generosity fades from memory. And then after each of these sort of apocalyptic visions, he asks, what are you going to do in the face of that? Who will you be? Who are you when the stage is burning? Who are you in the midst of personal public crisis, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so he's asking us to sort of consider these questions. How deep is our generosity, and how are we going to cultivate? What kind of generosity are we going to cultivate in order to allow ourselves to survive and thrive? The poem on some level is speaking to a radical generosity, and the visions, these apocalyptic visions. I mean, people have a lot of apocalyptic visions these days. So it is wild that someone 800 years ago is writing, when he says, misers rule, generosity fades from memory. Still, your eyes see, your heart is full. What wages will you pay? What clothes will you offer the stripped and bare? He asks us, what wages will you pay? I mean, it's almost like a letter to Jeff Bezos or somebody,
Mm-hmm. The book's called Gold. I noticed there's this thread of gold through the book. What's the gold?
Yeah, well, it's certainly not, speaking about the precious metal. He's speaking about a feeling state, right? This is the invisible gold. This is the real gold of existence. This is the feeling state that we achieve, How liberated are we from self-interest? How liberated are we from greed? How wide is our love? How deep is our love? How deep is our generosity? Gold is the deepest love. Gold is the deepest love. So he's in some way an alchemist. I mean, in terms of Sufism is about transformation, about these alchemical processes within, right? Transforming one mental state to another. So getting from a baser mental state or a baser way of being into a more sort of dazzling way of being, a more delightful, a more ecstatic, a more giving way of being, a freer way of being, more liberated way of being. That's the gold.
Mm.
So, in there's stages of self, right? There's nafs is the word for self, and there's stages of nafs. So when you go through these stages, starting from a very constricted place where everything is me, 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 and we see the world as me versus you, us versus them, and we see everything as separation and division. That's one way of seeing, right? That they describe, the Sufis describe, and Islam describes, right? And as we go through stages, then there's the sort of liberated space, head space that we get into where we do feel ourselves interconnected with everything. We do feel ourselves tasting oneness, right? We talk about oneness a lot, but sometimes we get into that state of mind, and there's an anatomical home for it, according to Dr. Jill Bolt Taylor, who had a stroke and lost her left hemisphere when she had the stroke, and she was able to experience the right hemisphere. And the reason I'm saying this, I'm not trying to, I don't want to reduce anything, but when she describes her experience the morning of the stroke, when she is inside the right hemisphere of her mind, it sounds like a Rumi poem. It sounds like the highest state of mysticism. She felt herself one with everything. There was no separation between her and the wall. Everything was flowing, moving molecules. And there was no yesterday, there was no tomorrow. There was no sense of her as an entity with a name and a prestigious title. All of that was gone. And there was this silent euphoria, as she calls it, that meditative place. Anyway, that's what the mystics are talking about. And this is not something that we experience all the time. This is not something we can experience all the time, but it's something that we can access and we inch towards. And it's something that we remember. And it's something that we then try to apply with, coming from that level of consciousness. We can sometimes flavor our decisions with that and then maybe act in more generous ways and, in more loving ways. And the earth, has been ravaged by this sense of separation. The rivers are polluted. There's been so much war. There are so many things that we've done from a place of utter division and separation that perhaps if we allowed ourselves to get into this state of mind more, if we allowed legislation sometimes to be driven by awareness of our interconnection, we would have better situation on the planet, right? So
yeah, hearing you talk, I'm moved. And it's interesting, like to me, I think even when I think of a meditation practice, the image is such of austerity, of a sort of like mental space almost of you're clearing your mind, but it's really, or this wrestling match with your mind or observing the thoughts. But this idea that space, that you call it a feeling state, that it's actually a sensual experience. That there's a meditation that's imbued with feeling and sense and sensuality. Am I right?
Yes, our senses are alive. We're listening. We're feeling. We're present. We're present.
Yeah.
To the wonder of existence, to the whole improbable wonder of existence, and that in and of itself is sort of the doorway to awe, right? When we are present in our senses, recognizing this sort of the wonders of the smallest things and just this incredible reality that we're actually alive. We actually have bodies. We actually have language. I mean, all of these things are so miraculous and we don't, not necessarily thinking about it all the time, but just like coming in contact with that wonder is a good thing, and again, wonder, awe, is part of reverence, and reverence is part of love. So, and it's part of the ecstatic. So
So other than reading this wonderful book of poetry and kind of following the thread or the suggestions of Rumi, what do you do or what could someone do? That's sort of unofficially the point of this podcast, is that if a listener were to hear this and take one suggestion or take something, extract something and apply it in earnest, that it could be transformative.
I would say the practice of deep listening. I would say it's good for all of us to sit down, if we can, for 20 minutes a day, 15 minutes a day, 10 minutes a day, whatever it is, and just sit down in silence and listen. Listen to Ali Akbar Khan, or listen to Haydn, or listen to anything, listen to music, and just allow yourself to be moved by it without any sort of self-referential thinking. And allow that kind of union, with sound, dissolve in sound, deep listening. This Sama practice is about that, I would say that that's a good thing to do. And that's a way of clearing the mind, it's a way of creating space in the mind and creating and allowing for a sensual experience. And a very present oriented experience. Because of course, music is a moving tapestry. So, there's no yesterday. You're just moving with the music. It's happening in real time and you're moving forward. And that's a good thing for the mind. It gets us, that sort of practice gets us out of the stuck places. The mind can sometimes get sticky, like we fall into a tar pit sometimes with our minds, of thinking of the past or whatever. Self-referential thinking can often be a tar pit, right?
Sure. Yeah. I sometimes use the image. I feel like when I'm just really struggling or it's like deep rumination like that I'm like wrestling with a barrel of saltwater taffy. That's like the image that I have, that you just, the more you get in there and struggle, the more enmeshed and stuck you are in this tar pit or barrel of taffies.
Right. And so it's about training the mind to move, right? Bob Dylan has a line about that too. Let the mind move like a freight train. Don't let it get stuck in, or creativity is like a freight train, he says, and so in a way it was, as I said, it was Rumi's practice of deep listening that kind of, I think, helped push him into his poetic practice, It got the engines oiled. The mind was moving,
Yeah. I think even the idea of deep listening might be more novel to someone than you think. And I wonder, just as a musician, that it might be a process that's so native to you at this point, but that I think often the way we engage with music is to just have something on kind of in the background.
That's right. Yeah. While we're multitasking.
While we're doing other things and going and taking care of the stuff. And actually, it's just sort of there as this background or baseline.
Right. And how much attention are we paying to it? Not much usually, right? So yes, it's something that's not done that much these days. I mean, when people were pulling out vinyl album and sitting down and listening to it in the 60s or whatever, or whenever, I mean, people listen to vinyl now, but I'm saying that was a thing, you got the album and sit down and listen to it for an hour. Now it's on Spotify and it's just running and running and running and we don't even know.
And how often would someone play even an album on Spotify from beginning to end?
Yeah. Yeah. And so there it is. That's a great practice, is sit down and listen to an album from beginning to end and let yourself, without checking Facebook or Instagram or TikTok, just let yourself be in a state of focus, attentive focus with music, and see what happens, right? There's a poem. He says, if you quit thinking for 1 hour, what will happen? If you plunge like a fish into love's ocean, what will happen? Right. And he goes on and on. What will happen? What will happen? But yeah, what will happen if you sit down and allow yourself that time to engage with something deeply without distracting yourself 8 million times and without self-referential thinking?
Yeah. And I know it becomes these little moments that, to open up an opportunity for that, it requires this little pause. Like at some moment, I need to just not grab the phone and even it has to occur to me that it's even possible that I could just, it may be a whole album, like a whole album might be ambitious to start, but someone could just
Yeah, five
find,
minutes.
yeah,
Yeah,
5 minutes.
5 minutes.
Yeah.
Start with 5 minutes. That's fine.
Do it in earnest.
Yeah. Yeah. An album is a big commitment these days. 45 minutes seems like, quite a long period of
Long
time.
time to go without looking at that
Yeah.
phone.
Yeah. But
Yeah.
take 5 minutes, take 10 minutes. Yeah.
Yeah, good place to start. Should people read these poems out loud? Do you recommend?
I think that would be great. I think it's wonderful when people recite poetry out loud. I think it comes to life, in a way that, the human voice brings an energy to it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've been fine. It's different. It's a different experience to recite out loud.
Yes.
We
Yes.
we have a book of your poem. We've been reading them at night as
Yes.
we go to bed, and it's a different thing. It's really a different thing.
Recite out loud.
You recite out loud because a little bit of performance anxiety. You're being seen, and you're with these words. And it becomes a very different thing to like hear your voice and hear these and feel these words in your mouth speaking.
Yes. Yes, it is. It's a sensual experience.
It totally is.
Mm-hmm.
Totally is.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe another poem?
Sure. Okay. Well, since we mentioned thinking and we also talked about greed for a moment, maybe I'll just read this one here.
Yeah, do it.
Don't think. Quit pouring thoughts like kerosene on everything fresh and green, burning it to the root. Be a fool, drunk on love, soaked in awe, till dry reeds are sweet as sugarcane. A lion leaps out of his cage. A man leaps out of his mind. Bravery is delicious madness, not some circumspect, cagey thought, sly and ungiving. Why scheme for a morsel? Curb your insatiable hunger, and you won't be seduced by a trickster or reduced to being one. When greed groans, I act deaf.
When greed groans, I act deaf.
Mm-hmm.
Is it that simple?
I mean, it's one strategy.
Sometimes I read Rumi and I'm just like, oh, is it that? Could it be that simple?
Well, it's funny because it's not simple. And I don't think he ever says it's simple. Here, let me read the poem right that follows that poem.
Okay.
Because that's a good question, what you're saying. And that's the beauty, I think, of him, of his work, is that he doesn't actually think any of this is simple. Navigating, living between matter and spirit, embodying both matter and spirit is challenging.
Okay, I want to hear the next poem because I get that impression a lot from. I'm like, what am I missing? Because this guy makes it look or sound so easy.
Right, here we go.
Yeah.
Who am I? Who am I? Who is this I? Prey to so many temptations, dragged this way and that, drawn to the ear like the string of a bow, shot forth like an arrow. The moment I close the door, an order from destiny falls on my roof. Am I a star in the zodiac, cycling through houses of fortune and disaster, laughing in one, weeping in another? One moment, I speed like wind. The next, I'm a loafer. One moment, I'm fire. The next, a flash flood. Now I'm levitating over the plains. Now I'm plodding through deserts and towns. Where do I come from? What rung do I stand on? In what market am I for sale? One moment I feel the sorrow of separation. One moment I'm a mystery in mystery's arms. Now waxing and waning in pace with the moon. Now whirling and staggering, drunk on the divine. Now I'm Joseph, thrown in the well. Now I'm his brother, looking down from the rim. One moment, bandit and ghoul. One moment, restless and glum. One moment perched on a high roof. Play the song mad lovers sing. Let me hear their passion. I broke through my chains. I wrenched the post from the ground. Stay by my side, beloved. Hear me out. Don't empty this cup of compassion. You are first and last, the light and prize at this feast. Pour wine from the tavern where meaning is on tap. For the devoted servant, there is no other wine. In a field of logic, my words are horses with no room to run. Without reason, the voice of my soul soars.
So why is that an answer to my question? I mean, I have my idea. I'd love to hear you.
Well, laughing in one, weeping in another, right? One moment I'm this, one moment I'm that. One moment I feel this, one moment I feel that. I mean, there's this constant, movement happening within us and without us. There's one moment bandit and ghoul, he says. One moment restless and glum. One moment perched on a high roof. It's not easy. I mean, he says, now I'm Joseph thrown in the well. So now I'm that victim that was thrown in the well. Now I'm his brother looking down from the rim, the one who pushed him in, right? So
but in the final push, it's I have broke the chains.
I broke the chains. Right. And there's that sense that, God, I broke the chains. And what are the chains? The chains of mind, reason, logic, as he says at the end, right? What are the chains? The chains are of categorizing things. The chains are of needing to define, right? When we are really this kind of moving entity that when we categorize, we kind of put things in little cages, and he's breaking out of the cage, out of the chains. He's wrenching the post from the ground. And then he's saying, stay by my side, beloved, to God or to a lover, hear me out. Don't empty this cup of compassion, right? And that's a call to himself too. Don't empty this cup of compassion because it ain't easy being human, right? And so we need compassion for each other. We need compassion for ourselves. All of us are moving through these houses. Like he says, I'm a star in the zodiac. All of us are moving through these houses of fortune and disaster, laughing in one, weeping in another. We gotta do our best to be easy on each other, have compassion for each other, have compassion for ourselves, allow ourselves to step outside of the left hemisphere, the separation, the me versus you, the good versus bad, the right versus wrong, and just say, oh my goodness, I am all, I am one with all, and it's a dance and I'm doing my best and I'm trying, right? I mean, we hope we're all trying. I'm the devoted servant, he says, for the devoted, pour wine from the tavern where meaning is on tap. The tavern of meaning, he says, right? The tavern is the charabat, is the place where all of these pronouns wash away on this wave of love's wine, meaning the me, you, us, them. We get the sense of oneness. It's the charabat, the tavern of ruin, is where the ego dissolves. The ego is just ravaged, and what you're left with is an emptiness that you're not afraid of. And actually, as he says in another poem, emptiness, the gold mine, joy streams from it, right? I mean, these are all really kind of confusing and complicated thoughts, but they're not really, right? I mean, it's just letting go of self, and uniting with this whole stream of existence in all its colors, recognizing that we embody the range and moving forward with compassion.
Haleh, thank you so much for your time.
Sure.
What a lovely conversation. The book comes out
March 8th, 2022.
March 8th. It's called Gold. It's a collection of Rumi poems. Where can they go? Just so we say it.
Yeah, there's a pre-order link. You can pre-order it. So you could post this whenever you want, and you could say you can pre-order it.
Okay, so we'll put the link.
If you want to be like
really cool. If you want to be like me.
In the know, long before the know.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, sure.
That concludes another episode of the 10,000 Heroes show. Your hosts were Ankur Shah Delight and Nathan Ramos. Special thanks to Pierre for the awesome episode artwork, to DJ Plainview for our theme music, and to our audio producer. If you like the show and you want to support our mission and our growth, here are 3 things you can do. 1. Think of 3 people you know who would enjoy the episode you just listened to, and tell them about it. Call them on the phone, send them a handmade watercolor postcard, or a text, or a link. But whatever, share your enthusiasm. 2, leave a review on your podcast platform. Apparently, having reviews actually works and is a great way for us to get found by new listeners. And 3, get in touch. Let us know how you feel. You can email us at info@10kh.show, follow us on Twitter at 10khshow, or leave a voice memo in this new voice mailbox I set up about how this episode affected your life. That link is in the show notes to this and every episode and should show up on your podcast platform. If not, you can always get it at our website, 10kh.show. Thank you and take care.